Section 43 of Monday Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Monday Tales by Alphonse Daudet, translated by Marion McIntyre. Section 43, The Blind Emperor, Part 2. Section 4, The Blue Country. Singular fact, these worthy Bavarians who bore us so much ill will because we did not espouse their cause in this war, felt not the least animosity towards the Prussians, neither shame at defeat nor hatred for their conqueror. "They are the finest soldiers in the world," the landlord of the Grappe Bleue said to me with a certain pride the morning of Kissingen, and that was the general sentiment in Munich. In the cafés there was a rush for the Berlin newspapers, and side-splitting laughter at the pleasantries of Kladderadatsch, those heavy Berlin jests, as ponderous as that famous pile-hammer of the Krupp factory, which weighs 50,000 kilograms. As everyone was certain that the Prussians would soon enter the city, all were disposed to receive them well. The beer shops laid in special supplies of sausages and meatballs, and houses in the city began to prepare chambers for the officers. Only the museums manifested some uneasiness. One day, upon entering the Pinakothek, I saw that the walls were bare, and the guardians of the place busied in nailing away the paintings in great packing cases, ready to be sent to the south. It was feared that the conquerors, extremely scrupulous regarding personal property, would not be quite so respectful of the collections of the state and of all the museums of the city. Only Colonel Seabolt's remained open. In his capacity as a Dutch officer, decorated with the Eagle of Prussia, the colonel felt assured that none would dare touch his collection, and while awaiting the arrival of the Prussians he merely walked back and forth in full uniform through the 3 long halls which the king had given him, fronting upon the court garden, a sort of Palais Royal, but greener and gloomier than ours, surrounded by cloistered walls painted in fresco. In that great dismal palace, that exhibition of curiosities, all carefully labelled, did indeed form a museum, a melancholy assemblage of things come from faraway lands, and snatched from the sphere in which they belonged. And old Seabolt himself seemed to form part of the collection. I went to see him every day, and together we passed long hours turning over the leaves of those Japanese manuscripts ornamented with plates, those scientific and historic works, the former so immense that it was necessary to spread them out upon the floor in order to open them, the others about as long as a fingernail, legible only with the aid of a magnifying glass, gilded, exquisitely done, and very valuable. Herr von Seabolt aroused my admiration with his Japanese encyclopedia in 82 volumes, and even translated for me an Ode of Hyok Nin, a marvelous work, published under the supervision of the emperors of Japan, and containing the biographies, portraits, and lyric fragments of 100 of the most famous poets of the empire. Then we arranged his collection of armor, golden helmets with huge chin-pieces, cuirasses, coats of mail, great two-handed swords which suggested the days of Knight Templars, and with which a body could be ripped open so easily. He explained, too, the amorous devices painted upon gilded shells, introduced me to Japanese interiors, showing me the model of his house at Yedo, a lacquered miniature where everything was represented, from the silken window shades to the rock work of the garden, a Lilliputian garden decorated with tiny plants and indigenous flora. But more than anything else, I was interested in those objects of Japanese worship, those tiny painted wooden gods, chasubles, consecrated vases, portative chapels, veritable pupazzi theatres, which every faithful worshipper has in some corner of his house. Tiny red idols are placed in the rear. A slender knotted cord hangs in front of them. Before commencing his prayer, the son of Japan bows, and by means of this cord strikes a bell, which shines at the foot of the altar. It is thus he attracts the attention of his gods. I took a childish pleasure in ringing these magic bells, and allowing my fancy to wander, carried onward by that wave of sound, even to the heart of those oriental Asias, where the rising sun seems to have gilded all things, from the blades of great swords to the edges of tiny books. When I left the museum, my eyes were still sated with all those reflections of lacquer and jade, and the brilliant coloring of geographical charts, especially on the days when the Colonel had read to me one of those Japanese odes of a poetic form both chaste and distinguished, original and profound. The streets of Munich produced a singular effect upon me. Japan and Bavaria were countries entirely new to me, both of which I became acquainted with at the same time, depending on the latter for my knowledge of the former. The two were mingled, confused in my brain, until they seemed one, an indistinct shadowy land, where everything was tinged with the color blue. That wandering blue line which I had just seen upon Japanese cups, sketched in cloudy outline, I found again traced upon the blue frescoes of the walls of Munich. Blue soldiers were drilling in the public squares, with Japanese helmets on their heads. The vast tranquil vault overhead was tinged with the blue of the forget-me-not, and it was a coachman in blue livery who had taken me to that hotel, the Grappe Bleue. Section 5. A sail across Lake Starnberg. In the blue country also was that shining lake whose sparkling image I still recall. Merely in writing the word Starnberg, I saw again that great sheet of water close to Munich, its smooth surface reflecting all the sky above. The smoke of a little steamer which sails along its shores lends a certain life and home-like air to the picture. On every side rise the sombre masses formed by the foliage of extensive parks, separated from each other in places by villas which make white gleaming gaps here and there. At a still greater elevation, villages with roofs crowded close together, nest-like houses built upon every acclivity, and looming above these rise the distant Tyrol mountains, the color of the atmosphere in which they seem to float. And in one corner of this picture, a scarcely classic but very charming figure in long gaiters and red silver-buttoned waistcoat, the old ferryman who cruised about with me one whole Sunday and seemed so proud to have a Frenchman in his boat. It was not the first time he had had this honor. He remembered very well that in his youth he had once ferried an officer across the lake. That was 60 years ago, and from the respectful fashion in which the worthy fellow spoke to me, I could judge what impression had been made upon him by that Frenchman of 1806, some gallant Oswald of the First Empire, in tights and hunting boots, wearing a gigantic schapska and all the insolence of a conqueror. If the ferryman of Starnberg is alive today, I doubt whether he has so much admiration for Frenchmen. Upon that beautiful lake and in the open parks surrounding the residential part of the city, the citizens of Munich disported themselves of a Sabbath on pleasure bent. The war had not caused the slightest departure from this custom. On the shore of the lake I saw in passing that the inns were full of people. Corpulent dames were seated in a circle, their skirts appearing upon the lawn like balloons. Between the branches, which almost touched each other above the blue sheet of water, groups of Gretchens and students passed by, wreathed in a nimbus of smoke from their pipes. A little farther on, in a glade of Maximilian Park, a bridal party of gaudily dressed, boisterous peasants were drinking before long trestle-like tables, while a green-coated gamekeeper, standing with his gun in his hand in the attitude of one about to fire, was demonstrating the power of that marvellous needle gun of which the Prussians had made use so successfully. But for that sight I would scarcely have remembered that fighting was in progress but a few leagues from us. Yet so it was, and the fact was perfectly credible. For that very evening, on my return to Munich, I saw upon a little place as sheltered and isolated as some church nook candles burning around the Marian Saal, and women were kneeling before it, their prayers shaken by prolonged sobs. Section 6. Bavaria. In spite of all that has been written for some years past upon French chauvinism and our patriotic follies, vanities, and fanfaronades, I do not believe that there is in all Europe a more boastful, vainglorious people, or one more infatuated with themselves than the people of Bavaria. All its small history, 10 detached pages of the history of Germany, is inscribed upon the streets of Munich in gigantic, disproportionate features in paintings and monuments like one of those toy Christmas books meant merely for children, with scarcely anything by way of text, but full of pictures. In Paris we have only one Arc de Triomphe. There they have 10 triumphal arches, a gate of victory, a marshal's porch, and I dare not say how many obelisks stand there, erected in commemoration of the bravery of Bavarian warriors. It is something to be a great man in that country. One is sure of having his name engraved everywhere in stone and bronze. At least one statue of him will stand in some public place, or surmounting some frieze amid white marble figures of victory. This insane fondness for statues, apotheoses, and commemorative monuments is carried to such an extent that at every street corner there are empty pedestals erected in readiness for the unknown celebrities whom tomorrow may bring forth. By this time every place must be occupied. The War of 1870 furnished them with so many heroes, so many glorious episodes. For instance, it pleases me to fancy that I see the illustrious General von der Tann, clad in antique undress, standing in the midst of a verdant square upon a beautiful pedestal, ornamented with bas-reliefs representing on one side Bavarian warriors setting fire to the town of Bazeilles, on the other, Bavarian warriors assassinating wounded French soldiers at the field hospital of Worth. What a splendid monument that would make! Not content with having their great men scattered in this fashion over the entire city, the Bavarians have reunited them all in a temple situated at the city gates, and named the Ruhmeshall, Hall of Fame. Beneath a vast portico of marble columns, whose projecting angles form 3 sides of a square arranged upon consoles, are the busts of electors, kings, generals, jurisconsults, etc. A catalogue may be obtained in the custodian's room. Slightly in front rises a colossal statue, Bavaria herself, 90 feet high, standing at the summit of one of those great gloomy staircases which are open to the air on all sides and rise in the midst of verdurous public gardens. With a lion's skin upon her shoulders, her sword clenched in one hand, in the other the crown of fame, fame always, this immense bronze figure at the hour when I saw it, towards the close of one of those August days, when the shadows lengthen enormously, filled the silent plain with its emphatic gesture. All around a stretch of columns and profiles of celebrated men grimacing in the setting sun. The scene was so deserted, so dismal, and as I heard the sound of my own footsteps echoing upon the flaggings, there returned to me again that impression of emptiness and grandeur combined which had pursued me since the moment of my arrival in Munich. Through the interior of Bavaria runs a little winding cast-iron staircase. The whim seized me, and I climbed to the very top and seated myself for a moment in the head of the Colossus, a tiny rotunda-like room, lighted by 2 windows which form the eyes of Bavaria. In spite of those open eyes facing the blue horizon of the Alps, it was very hot in that little room. The bronze, warmed by the sun, enveloped me in an oppressive heat, and I was obliged to descend again very quickly. Nevertheless, I was there long enough to know thee, O mighty Bavaria, big-voiced and grandiloquent. I have seen thy chest without a heart, thy huge arms, like those of some singer, puffy and without muscles, thy sword of wrought metal, and I have discovered in thy hollow head the dull drunkenness and torpor of the beer-drinker's brain. And to think that in embarking upon that mad war of 1870, our diplomats counted upon thee. Ah, if they too had only taken the trouble to ascend Bavaria. Section 7. The Blind Emperor. I had been 10 days in Munich without receiving the slightest news of my tragedy. I had begun to despair when one evening in the little beer garden where we were taking our meals I saw my colonel appear with a radiant countenance. "I have it," he said. "Come tomorrow morning to the museum. We will read it together. You shall see for yourself how fine it is." He was very animated that evening. His eyes sparkled as he spoke. He declaimed quite loudly whole passages of the tragedy, trying to sing the choruses. 2 or 3 times his niece was obliged to make some attempt at restraining him with her "Oncle, oncle." I attributed this fever and exaltation to genuine lyric enthusiasm, and indeed the fragments that he recited to me seemed very beautiful, and I was in haste to obtain possession of my masterpiece. The following day, when I arrived in the court garden, I was much surprised to find the collection hall closed. For the colonel to be absent from his museum was so extraordinary an event, that as I hastened to his quarters, a vague fear took possession of me. The street where he dwelt was a little out of the city, a short, quiet street, with gardens and low houses. It was less quiet than usual. Groups of people were talking in the doorways. The door of the Seabolt house was closed, the shutters open. People were entering it, leaving it, with sorrow in their mien. One could feel that this was one of those catastrophes too large for a single home to hold it, and that it had overleaped its confines and invaded the street as well. As I entered, I heard sobs. They came from the rear of a little passage where was a large room, as well lighted and crowded with objects as a schoolroom. In it was a long white wooden table, books, manuscripts, glass cases for collections, albums covered with embroidered silk, and upon the wall Japanese armor, engravings, big geographical charts, and amid all this disorder of study and travel, the colonel lay stretched upon his bed, his long straight beard resting upon his chest, while weeping at one side knelt the poor little oncle. Colonel Seabolt had died suddenly in the night. I left Munich the same evening, not having the heart to disturb so much sorrow merely for the sake of a literary fantasy. And so it was that I never knew more of that marvelous Japanese tragedy than the mere title, The Blind Emperor. Since that day we have seen another tragedy enacted for which that title imported from Germany would have been most appropriate. Sinister indeed it was, but not Japanese, that tragedy full of blood and tears. End of section 43. End of Monday Tales by Alphonse Daudet, translated by Marion McIntyre.